Welcome back to the program. We are joined again by Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, the former Chief of Staff to the Secretary of State, Colin Powell. And the purpose today is to discuss some of the militarism that has gotten out of control, which is exhausting the US as well as the other NATO allies in terms of military strength, economic strength, moral standing, and also the position in the world. Also, of course, risking what could become a world war as well. So, on that pessimistic note, welcome.
Good to be with you again, Glenn. Been since Columbia University, right?
Yeah, it's been 2 weeks now. Well, I I thought that all obviously is not well anymore. We kind of set fire to the entire Middle East and now installed an Al Qaeda leader in Syria, backing a genocide in Gaza, and it looks as if another war with Iran could be imminent. And with all the wars over the past 3 decades, one often gets the impression that this is, complete chaos and lack of direction, almost as if these permanent wars were accidental. But what is fascinating, though, is that one could draw a line to after the Cold War. There's this quote by Wolfowitz in 1990 where he argues that that with the end of the Cold War, we can now use our military strength with impunity. The Soviets won't come in to block us, and we have 5, maybe 10 years to clean up these old Soviet surrogate regimes like Iraq and Syria before the next superpower emerges to challenge us. Now, again, if one jumps ahead another decade to 2001, this is where what I want to discuss with you as well. You had this very famous comment by General Wesley Clark, where he's informed afterwards that they're not only going after Iraq, but he makes a statement that the Pentagon is planning to go after 7 countries in 5 years, and he has this list. I mean, he's written it in a book. It's on audio or video, and then essentially that the U.S. planning to go after Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off with Iran. Now, this was back in 2001. I wanted to ask you, though, because again, this is you were there in the White House during those years. How did you react, though, when you learned about this plan, these 7 countries in 5 years? And I guess,
You
yeah,
left
well,
2 out.
sorry?
You left 2 countries out, and they were very prominent for me, particularly for my position at the State Department, because John Bolton was advocating for both. And John Bolton was allied with the neoconservative clique, if you will, that wanted to do all this, North Korea and Cuba. I heard that from Bolton as much as I did anything else. He sometimes would go off on Syria at length, but he was really concerned about Cuba and North Korea. So the first briefing I got that stunned me in the Pentagon, because I'm somewhat of a Korean expert, spent every year on the peninsula for about a decade and served on the peninsula and did every team spirit exercise out of Hawaii on the peninsula. So I know Korea pretty well, and I get this briefing from an Air Force 3-star in the Pentagon before Rumsfeld kicked me out about how we're going to take on North Korea. And so I had not only the briefing on the 7 countries, the clean break strategy, if you will, but I also had the Korea and Cuba business going. And I found it all astounding that we were taking that approach to the world post-Cold War, because I'd known from my experience with George H.W. Bush that that was anything but the way he wanted to take. His whole approach was, I'm not going to beat my chest. He actually said that. He used those words. I'm not going to beat my chest. I'm not going to preen over the victory. But I am going to do what I can to make sure that what we started after World War II and more or less perfected in the Geneva Conventions and other things like that is the way we approach the world, which is why he insisted, absolutely insisted on having the UN resolution for the first war in Iraq. and insisted also, to great criticism from his enemies, both in the Republican Party and elsewhere, that he quit once the mandate was fulfilled. All the UN asked him to do was reverse the aggression, and he reversed the aggression. And then he left and suffered for that. Suffered so badly that the Israelis threw their support behind his opponent in the election and got him defeated. Bill Clinton was elected, with whom the Israelis were much more comfortable. After all, H.W. Bush had forced them into the Oslo process and had been very adamant with them about responding to anything Saddam Hussein did while he was fighting Saddam Hussein. In fact, he put military officers with the Israeli Defense Forces, and they were to watch those forces and make sure they did not do anything with regard to Saddam Hussein. Even when Saddam Hussein shot a few Scud missiles at them, they could not respond. So that was the break point in dealing with the end of the Cold War in a human, in a humane, in a decent way, and what came afterwards, which was anything but that. Building over time with the war in the Balkans, the bombing of Serbia, the creation of Kosovo, which Russia still hasn't recognized, and all the things we did to Yeltsin and then Putin up to Ukraine, and the perfidy and deceitfulness we've shown with regard to that. That's all a product of post-H.W. Bush presidents. And I don't forgive any of them for it. I don't forgive President Obama for it, even though he's the one I met with in the White House and told me that he knew there was a bias in Washington towards war. After serving, 7 years as president of the United States, he tells me that.
Made that discovery, but he also had a bias, it would seem, or did he just fall in line towards the more?
The message he gave us that day in the Roosevelt room was that Samantha Power had been summarily dispatched to be UN ambassador to get her out of his hair, and then John Kerry was sitting beside him instead of Hillary Clinton for similar reasons. But I think he thought he was compelled into the Libya conflict, and I think he thought he was going to be compelled into Syria. And John Kerry was being lectured in that room that day as Obama was speaking to him as well as to us, no ground troops in Syria. Because if you recall, Kerry was advocating for ground troops in Syria at that time as Secretary of State. So Obama might have listened and got the message, but nonetheless, he continued the same kind of approach to the world.
But once this memo came out, because many people has seen it, what are the conversations there in the White House or the Pentagon regarding the implications? Because this is a very different approach to security. I mean, the main rival, the Soviet Union, the Cold War is all gone, and to have this as a solution. Now, I um, I spoke recently to Fritz, so one of your colleagues, who was making the point that there was a genuine bit of desire for for vengeance after 9/11 for good reasons, but also he said that a bit more dark was the desire by many in the government to, I guess, to take advantage of it, to use this as an opportunity to clean up a region where there was still many governments which they didn't care for. But surely, with the recognition that there's consequences and the pushbacks, what were the main discussions again once they got this kind of shocking memo of all the countries that would have to or all the governments which would have to go?
I'm quite confident that President George W. Bush, given his inexperience and particularly in national security affairs, and naivete, I don't say that in a derisive fashion, just naivete, he didn't know anything about this. He knew that he wanted to do the things that would get him reelected. And he knew that if he had a war and he won the war, that would get him reelected, because he saw how his father went from 90% in the polls post first Iraq war down, plummeting toward the end of his term. he knew that the war had to be timed, in other words, so that not only would it be seen as a success, but it would continue to be seen as a success more or less through the 2004 elections. I think that was a primary political motivation for him. I think there were many reasons why he went to war in Iraq, but I don't think he was one of these people. I do not think he was one of these clean break people. Cheney, on the other hand, was quintessential that. And I think Rumsfeld was to a certain extent, and Paul Wolfowitz, of course, and ultimately the man, the traitor in the Pentagon. Traitor. Do I need to spell that out? Traitor. Douglas Fike, dual citizen, and surrounded by Mossad in the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy's office for the entire duration of his time in the Pentagon. Even Rumsfeld said one time to Powell, I don't run the Pentagon, Israel does. Well, that was a little bit of a misstatement in my view, because Rumsfeld knew damn well we were using Israel as much as they were using us. But what I saw was piecemeal, because once Richard Haas, the director of policy planning staff, had put me in charge of the policy planning talks with the Pentagon, and we dispatched ourselves for the first 2 or 3 meetings in the Pentagon, Rumsfeld kicked us out because he didn't want the State Department. This is my perception of it anyway. And Richard Haas, who talked to Condi Rice, the national security advisor, almost every day, sort of confirmed it for me. He didn't want us over there spying. He didn't want us knowing what was happening. And in particular, Wolfowitz didn't want us to know what was happening. So we got it piecemeal. Like I said, I got the North Korea bunch because I was over there for the briefing, being a Korea expert. I got the clean break strategy generally spoken to me, if you will, by some neoconservatives that were around Powell in the State Department. And incidentally, we got rid of most of those before the first year was up. And I got the message that I didn't really believe from Richard Haas very, very soon, that we were going to war with Iraq, because he talked to Condi all the time. Blew the Middle East experts on the policy planning staff off their chairs almost when he said that, because this is the summer of 2001. We haven't even had 9/11 yet. And it got worse as we went along. All to say that it wasn't clear to us that this was not just a bunch of nuts, as H.W. Bush had said when Wolfowitz sent him over the defense strategy that he wanted to get approved. Bush wrote on it, send this back to the crazies in the bottom of in the basement of the Pentagon. That's what H.W. Bush thought of this idea. Well, now we had them there, and we had a Secretary of Defense, a Vice President in league with him, and an innocent, if you will, inexperienced president. So they went full bore. But it was not obvious to me that this was what was happening in real time in front of my face, that this crazy idea was actually being implemented using as its impetus, which if you go back and read the clean break strategy, they talk about Pearl Harbor and what it did for FDR, as the motivation. 9/11 was their Pearl Harbor, and that gave them the impetus to go, they thought, all the way to Iran. And we're getting ready to see whether or not they accomplish their purpose in terms of that country, because Bibi's going to spoil this deal, I think, not by backing up on the deal, as it were, but by going to war with Iran and negating the deal.
Well, much of cleaning up the region was also tied into the idea of ensuring that, or cementing the unipolar moment, or, well, that the next century would be, as they said, an American one. But
They're doing exactly the opposite of that. They're making sure that it will not be an American one.
yeah, this is this is the shameful part. All the loss, not just the material power, but the soft power, all I mean, all that power which was concentrated in the U.S. This has been drained away over the past 2.5 to 3 decades. So it's I mean, in retrospect, you would think that the lessons would have been learned, but this is kind of what where part of my concern is that that there's no correction though after Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, neither turned out well, but we continue down this path. We have Libya, Syria, and again, also did not turn out well at all. And with all this messes behind us, we're moving on to Iran. This is quite quite shocking. Why do you think there's no correction there? Because they, I mean, it's not a controversial thing to say that from Iraq, Libya, Syria, that these were largely failures. So why? And also, we already had the war with Iran. It did not turn out as expected. The Iranians did not rise up against their government. The decapitation strike didn't work. The Iranians were not a paper tiger. They were quite forceful. So how come? Why do you think we're still going down the same path?
Well, in many respects, we're not. And one of my perplexing questions of myself right now, and increasingly of others, I met with 4 people yesterday on this, is Trump aware of what he's doing? Is anyone in his administration aware of what he's doing? However inchoate it might look to the average viewer, there are some things he's doing that indicate a response to this. One is he seems to be more interested in using proxies to fight his wars for him than doing it with the U.S. And that tells me that somehow he knows how desperate we really are in terms of real power. And when I say real power, I'm telling you that we can't even make artillery rounds without China. We don't have any TNT in this country. We haven't made TNT in this country for 40 years. We get almost everything we need for the key ingredients to our military apparatus from overseas, much of it from China, and China has shut it down. We couldn't make artillery rounds. We couldn't make cruise missiles. We couldn't make much of what we have as a panoply of defense instruments today if we had to now because of what China has done to us, whether it's critical minerals or just key things we don't do in this country anymore that we have become accustomed to others doing for us. The supply chain is not necessarily there, in other words. Half the THAAD missile inventory of the United States military is in Israel. Half of it. Trump somehow has stumbled on this idea of homeland security. I'm not happy with the way he articulated it. And this idea in the new defense strategy of retreating to the Western Hemisphere, not just, I think, because that's what he wants to do philosophically, politically, whatever. It's also an inevitability and a necessity because we cannot defend our far-flung empire anymore. What does that mean for what's going on in the world with regard to the ongoing proxy conflicts? That's anybody's guess, but I think we're going to back out of Ukraine fully, completely. We couldn't get the equipment to NATO to get to Ukraine if we tried. In the next 4 to 6 years, we might get some of it there. We can't even get the equipment to Taiwan we've been promising. We can't get it to them because we don't have it to get to them. Is Trump knowledgeable of that in the sense that he is pulling back and changing 50 plus years, 70 years of U.S. strategy, 45 forward? Never again will we be caught. We'll always be forward. We'll always be in Europe. We'll always be in Japan. We'll always be there. We'll fight our enemies forward. We'll never get caught like we did in 1939 and 40. Are we changing? And I'm not going to call it isolationism. I'm going to call it reality because we can't do what we've been doing for the last half century. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. But I know that some of the things that flowed out of Quantica, heinous that the meeting was overall, but some of the things that flowed out of there and 1 or 2 remarks that flowed out of Trump's mouth and out of Hegseth's mouth indicate to me that they realize this situation. And so these wars are going to stop in terms of U.S. participation, except as they are ongoing right now. And those two are going to be wound down. What that means, ultimately, I don't know. I don't know. Trump seems to be saying that it means we're going to focus on the hemisphere, on things like Venezuela, on things like cities that are blue and democratic and good political use of the military there. But I don't know. I just don't know. But I think this clean break strategy is over. It's over. It will be terminated if Bibi goes to war with Iran, because it will be terminated by Iran.
In Europe, when we assess the United States, we always look towards the intentions rather than the capabilities. The assumption is that the US has an unlimited amount of firepower, but as you suggest, it's an awkward situation now that if the US would want to go and fight China and it really needs the proper artillery rounds, then, well, China has the antimony, which we need to produce those. So it is, yeah, and we see now China beginning to reduce the supplies of rare earth minerals where it's used in weapons. So
100% in a lot of key categories. I just found this out. It's 100% stoppage in a lot of key categories that are absolutely essential to our weaponry.
so this is demilitarizing its opponents. I mean, this is
Bingo.
usually the language we're speaking in. So it's quite extraordinary. You did mention, though, that Trump is more interested now to fight through proxies. And again, it's not a new thing to use proxies, but the difficult thing for the Europeans to appreciate is that we always thought that, we were having a seat at the table. We would be the ones using proxies. I think it's slow.
That you would be the proxy.
Well, we're slowly coming to terms with this, that we are the new proxies as Trump is handing over the Ukraine war to the Europeans. But it is an interesting development of Europe, because in the early 90s you had the real pushback from, well, especially countries like France, who were saying, you know what, we need a balance to the US, because the Cold War has to be followed by a multipolar system, speaking a bit like the Chinese, Indians, and Russians of today. So we need some check on this in order for the UN to play a larger role as opposed to the US dictating to the world. And also, again, going back to after this memo, when the US went to war against Iraq, the Europeans were hesitant, which is why they had to rely on this coalition of the willing. But today, the Europeans are much more hawkish, it seems, than the United States. So we can't seem to get into a war with Russia fast enough. And the assumption is, as long as the Americans are following us into this war, then it will be all fine. I mean, this is not even Europe for 5 years ago. What do you, how do you assess what's happened to the Europeans?
I think they're so desperate to keep the United States in, as it were, that they'll do anything. I really do. But I think that's coming to a halt. I think it's coming to a halt with the disappearance very soon of 3 key leaders: Armour, Macron, and Merz. I don't think they might, Macron in particular might not last out the year. But I don't think any of them will last out the next 12 to 18 months if they do that. And that's going to change things dramatically, I think. I was just interviewed by a team from Berlin for about an hour and a half. And we talked about everything from Helmut Kohl and Francois Mitterrand and Jim Baker and George H.W. Bush and Colin Powell and the period immediately upon the Cold War's end to the present day. And one of the things I asked each of them, 2 of them were GDR guys, they'd come from the East German complement of Germany. And one was from Berlin itself and counted himself a former West German. Germany's falling apart. And they all had the idea that was expressed by the most articulate one of them this way: we were probably the world's best, if not best small, best medium size. We thought of ourselves as the best, period, manufacturing center on the face of the earth. we were really going bangers. And now we've lost it. We've lost it. And a lot of it is the energy situation, but a lot of it too is bad government. And that's happening, I think, across Europe to a certain degree, but Germany's the real case in question, the basket case, if you will. And what that's going to mean is, at least initially, what it's showing right now, got to tuck ourselves into the empire. Got to have the empire, got to be with the empire. We'll bring the snapback sanctions on Iran, even though we know it's stupid and self-defeating to do so, because that's what the empire wants. That's not going to last. It's not going to last. Trump is going to be true to his many words. He's not going to stay in Europe. He's leaving. And I wouldn't be surprised that if he lasts the entire 4 years, it doesn't go beyond that, that we would be out of Europe. Our forces would be out of Europe. That sounds crazy right now when they're in Poland and they're in Finland and they're in Estonia, but it's true, and it's also true that we don't have a lot of troops to be anywhere anymore. So maintaining Ramstein will be key because they won't let him, the military won't let him get rid of Ramstein, I'm sure, because it's so key to ultimately anything we do, particularly with regard to Russia or China. But that's going to be the last vestige of America in Europe, I think. And will it stay much longer than a decade? I doubt it. So we're coming home. The new defense strategy reflects that. It reflects retrenchment, and that's what we're going to do. And those remarks at Quantico sort of reflected that too, if you think about it.
I think Macron would probably have to be dragged out of office because it doesn't matter how many prime minister he runs out of. And any other one president would have resigned by now. But no, he's holding on there. But the German case is quite fascinating because this was the economic powerhouse of Europe. It was learned kind of from history. It had all this. It almost symbolized Europe's break with its own history. But now, of course, they're back at it, and this eagerness of building an army to fight Russia when Ukraine invaded Kursk, again, Russian region where the Nazis were in World War II. You had these German generals grinning like, this is where we were back in the day. I mean, it was so strange. So again, now they're so eager to fight Russia, and also even within the European Union, because the Germans want a larger role, that puts Merz in a conflict with von der Leyen. And I think it was only yesterday you had the Germans want one of the Ukrainians suspected of blowing up Nord Stream. Well, sounds like a patsy, but nonetheless, they want him sent to Germany, and the Polish prime minister says, well, the only thing you should do is apologize for building the Nord Stream to begin with. So they're now protecting the people who blew up Germany. I mean, even the closest allies now, they're having more and more tensions. The Hungarians aren't too happy with the Germans either. And while all this is happening, what is the goal for Germany to put itself back on the right track? When the economy is going down the toilet, they're having dreams of building up the most powerful military in Europe. They're talking openly about banning the main opposition, which is polling higher than the highest of all the political parties. They're openly backing genocide in Gaza. I mean, it's a very different Germany now than it was a few years ago. It's kind of extraordinary how we ended up here. And, it's not to pick on the Germans because the rest of the Europeans, I mean, it's becoming a bit of a nasty place. It feels like the way the politicians talk, the priorities they have. I mean, this whole idea, we can't have welfare states anymore. Now it's time to do warfare. The whole idea that you boycott diplomacy for 3.5 years while you have a major war in Europe where hundreds of thousands of men are dying and it could escalate to nuclear war. I mean, the EU was supposed to be a peace project. Again, but back to my point, this is not this is a very different Europe than what we saw in the 90s and even a few years ago. But this is what.
Very different. And I go back to Colin Powell's conversations with me when I first joined him in 1989. And he said, soon the Mitterrands, the Kohls, the Majors, the Thatchers, they'll all be gone, and it'll be a different Europe. Well, I think he had a different appreciation for it, and he brought that appreciation into the chairmanship. The initial years that were fairly positive with regard to U.S.-Russia relations, and that was that Europe would stand up on its own, and it would have good leadership to do that. It would find a de Gaulle. It would find a Kohl. It would find, whatever. It didn't. What it found was the same thing America found, a series of idiots, or a series of people who didn't know what the hell they were doing, a series of people who had no comprehension of what Europe's past was, no comprehension of what had been done in terms of monumental union, really, for Europe. And that's what we got. And at the same time, you got the same really inexperienced and in some very real ways, unwise leadership in the empire. We haven't had a decent president since H.W. Bush. They've all been sorry presidents. I'm sorry. They've all been sorry presidents, Obama included. And that's what it's got us. It's got us this world that has had no leadership for a quarter century plus, lots of wars to fret that leadership, many of whom were responsible for those wars, especially in the empire, fighting back and forth in terms of the one that created the greatest schism between the United States and Germany, for example, when Bush essentially said F-U-C-K Schroeder in the Oval Office, and Joschka Fischer and Colin Powell had to hold hands under the table, so to speak, to keep the relationship intact. And even during that, I've never talked about this before, but even during that period, both men, as they exchanged cooking gear going one way and beer going the other way, would talk about how Europe's future was speculative, didn't know where it was going, because they saw the fracturing beginning already in the transatlantic link and the lack of really good leadership and the political processes that were more or less producing that lack of good leadership all across the board, and even in America. Although I don't think Colin Powell thought we were going to get to the point where George W. Bush would be the president he was. He had convinced Powell he was going to be a very different kind of president than the president he turned out to be. And you could say 9/11 did that to him. I don't know. I think Dick Cheney did that to him. But we've had sorry leadership, and the sorry leadership in democracies means you go downhill. And that's where we're going, both of us, Europe and the empire.
So what does this mean then for the transatlantic relationship? Because when the Cold War came to an end, and then 2 years later, the Soviet Union was dissolved, the main question was, what about NATO now? Which is why our discussions in the 90s were, you have to, now the NATO needed to expand to have a new purpose. Also, it needed to pursue this more interventionism, so abandon the defensive strategy because, well, if it's a defensive alliance, you don't really need it when there's no main opponent. So the slogan was out of area or out of business, suggesting we have to now start to do military interventionism. But where do you see this heading now, though, especially with the wars in the Middle East and the pending loss in the Ukraine and also the United States taking on different priorities in a multipolar world? Do you see NATO's role being able to be sustained?
You just put your finger in a phrase on the problem. Out of area or out of business. That's precisely the motivation for what's happening now and what is tearing NATO apart. Out of area or out of business. And that little phrase sums it up so well, because you really meant out of business. You meant no more money for Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Grumman, all those different companies and their equivalents in Europe. It meant no more imperial overstretch, which everyone had grown absolutely accustomed to and wanted to continue. Why didn't they say out of business and close it down? And Europe stand up its own security identity, as we wanted to do in 1991 and 92, and become independent of everything but the nuclear umbrella. That was it. It's a pretty good plan if you think about it. Europe becomes its own security other than nuclear weapons. And there was even some talk of consolidating the nuclear weapons. In other words, France and Britain would all consolidate under the U.S. umbrella. We decided that wasn't doable. But those forces are small forces anyway. But you could continue the relationship economically, financially, and otherwise. Be terrible to sever it, really. But you didn't have to continue this business of out of area or out of business, which was nonsense. It was a defensive alliance set up with the express purpose of keeping the Russians out, the Germans down, and the Americans in. Well, they're gone. The Russians, we want them in now. That would have been the commonsensical, brilliant even, although I think it's just commonsensical way of going forward on both sides of the Atlantic. We didn't. We decided to keep the status quo, even increase the status quo, as it were, and to continue to be in business. What is the business now? It's war in Ukraine. It's fractured Europe. It's an EU that looks ever more feckless every day. Old Vanderland stays in business. And it's looking around the world for other creatures to go after when it knows damn well if it goes after them, it's going to end its days on the earth. I mean, this is just pure bullshit. And yet it's going on. But go back and look at the period in the beginning, 1914, 1915. It's happened before. It can happen again. People will say it can't happen again that badly. I say, well, it can happen even more badly. It can go nuclear.
George Kennan, he made this, he wrote this comment on toward the end of the Cold War. I think it's in 1987 or something, that if the Soviet Union would sink into the sea tomorrow, the US would have to invent another enemy quick, because so much of the economy and the whole the structure of society has been built around this whole not just the military industrial complex, but also the need to have this opponent to rally around. And he would argue that they would have to invent a new one. And you can of course extend this to the political West. Well, what's holding us together?
And look at how swiftly we switched. I served one administration that was all for China being in the WTO, all for China being an equal, and all for what we call strategic competition. And in that strategic competition definition was economic, financial. There was no war in there. Everyone was going to keep their powder dry, of course, but there was no war in there. All of a sudden, boom, we shifted. We found China. And are trying our feverish best to get the Europeans to be with us and to get NATO to be with us against China. That's collapsed. I think that's like a balloon popped. Not going to work. China's too important to the world, too important to Europe. You see those 3 railroads, actually 4 now, that are coming into Europe from China. The one that runs south part of Iran and up through along the Persian Gulf up into the soft belly of the Caucasus, if you will, all running now, all with trains, all delivering cargo.
It's just like the common denominator in all the conflicts around the world now is that the only solution which is being considered appears to be a military solution. I mean, one can go through all the continents, from Venezuela to China to Russia, Middle East. It's always the military option. And I wish there was some point we could take a step back and just ask, well, this is different than the Cold War. If you look at Russia today, what are the main reasons we can't share a continent with them today? I mean, we make up these stories about being Hitler restoring Soviet Union, but there's a lot of nonsense. If the government in Ukraine had been toppled, we wouldn't be here. there is, in terms of their ideology or values or their aspirations, it's not as if we can't come to not everything will be perfect, but this talk from the leadership now that well, if a nuclear war is what it takes, then we can't bow to Hitler 2.0. It's so beyond crazy. There's so many diplomatic possibilities and pathways which has been ignored now for the past 30 years. It's just it continues to astonish me that everything needs to have a military solution to it, though. But on on that, though, do you have any thoughts on in terms of what's happening now with Iran? Just as a final question, do you think we're heading towards yet another war?
Let me answer one other aspect of what you just said, which deeply concerns me. Going back to Powell's conversation with me in 1989 about the future of Europe and the type of leaders they're going to have, these people who talk about nuclear war really frighten me. They really frighten me because they don't know what they're talking about. They weren't raised in the period. They don't understand all the discussions and debates we had, all the escalation doctrine we developed, all the things we did, all the principles we laid down, the bunkers we dug in our backyards. They don't understand that. They're going to get it in the face, and the world's going to get it in the face. That scares me more than anything else. These naive people who talk about nuclear war and toss it around as if it were just another form of warfare. It ain't, people. It will destroy you and everything around you. I think we're going to war with Iran. I think now it's going to be because Bibi has got himself in a pickle with this deal. He's managed to convince Smotrich and others, Ben-Gvir, to hang around in the coalition. But that's based on their understanding that he's given them in Hebrew behind the doors that he's not going to stop killing Hamas. And that unless Hamas disarms completely so he can kill them even faster and better, then he's not going to, consolidate this deal. What's he going to do to Donald Trump? Because Donald Trump has thinks anyway, that he's got Bibi by the short hairs and that Bibi is going to do exactly what he wants him to do. Well, the way Bibi's going to disrupt that is start the war with Iran. And he's going to dare Donald not to come in. Now, Steve Bannon said the other day that he thinks Trump will say no and let Bibi sweat in his own defeat. I think that's crazy. I do not think that. I think that's what Bannon was implying. I don't think that's going to happen. I think Trump is going to, reluctantly perhaps, but he's going to come in too. If that happens, then all of this we're talking about right now has not only the prospect of turning nuclear really fast before anybody knows what's happening. The Israelis have perfected a nuclear weapon launch from one of their submarines. That would be the way I would think it would begin. So we're going to not only negate everything that everybody's talking about so positively with regard to Gaza, and I don't even know how they'd find anything positive in it, because all Bibi will do, even if the deal goes through, is keep killing them on a low burner and annex the West Bank and all the other things he's going to do. He's not going to be stopped, in other words, but I think he realizes that he's going to be in an existential situation, politically and otherwise, if he doesn't start this war. And this is his last promise. He's going to start this war. He's going to get beaten, and he's going to have to call the United States in. And when we come in, that's the unraveling of the empire in less than a decade. And probably, sad to say, my worst fears will come true. We'll let the nuclear genie out of the bottle.
So you think the Israelis could use a nuclear weapon against Iran unless the U.S. comes along, or irrespective of it?
It just depends on the timing, I think. If Trump is reluctant and appears to be reluctant and Bibi thinks it's existential, I have no doubt in my mind that he'll use nuclear weapons. This is Bibi's last evil gift to the planet. He'll be a first again in terms of tactical nuclear weapons used on the battlefield. He'll join the United States in the only states in the world that have ever used nuclear weapons against living human beings.
Have you heard anything, though, from former colleagues or intelligence that Israel could be heading down this path?
I think there's consensus amongst a group of us who've been following this very closely, commenting on it on podcasts and other things like that, alternative media mostly. I've even made a couple of comments on mainstream media about it when they would have me. And I think the consensus is 60-70% certainty. We all hope that we're wrong. We all hope that wisdom intervenes somewhere along here. We all hope that Donald Trump grows up and does what he should do, forcefully, in his face, tells Bibi, if you start a war with Iran, you're done. We're done with you and you're done with us. But I don't think that's in the cards. I just do not think it's there. And the Iranians are ready. They're ready. I was told yesterday, Glenn, that by a person who has been very vocal with me and elsewhere, about the lack of cohesiveness amongst the Iranian people post the real movement of the women. You remember a few years ago that when the woman was killed, you had this incredibly forceful movement where the women were repudiating much of what the theocratic government was saying. And it looked as I was even on record as saying that I thought the regime was unraveling, and I thought that these women were basically responsible for it. And either the regime had to come out with some very relaxed, more lenient rules with regard to women, and therefore abandon a lot of their beliefs with regard to their version of Islam, or it had to crack down mercilessly, and that would be probably the reason for a revolt, an armed revolt. And first answers I got were, they don't have enough weapons. I said, little you know, I know how many weapons they have, how many weapons have been smuggled into Iran. Well, all to say that recently, from some very good sources, I find people saying this: never has there been in my lifetime such unity amongst the Iranians, Persian or otherwise. Never has there been such unity. It's not because they love the government, it's because they love Iran. And it's not because they want to help the government do this or that with regard to their governing. It's because they see the United States and Israel as total, utter Satans. They've disabused themselves now. The Iranian people, who used to think the American people were the last vestige of anti-colonialism on the face of the earth and wanted better relations with us, they all hate us now, and they are ready for whatever comes. This is going to be a hell of a war. A hell of a war. It's going to be over pretty quickly, I think. And Bibi's going to be in deep, deep trouble. And that's what makes me think there's a real good chance he'll go to nuclear weapons.
Well, on that very depressing note, we'll wrap it up unless you have any final comments or thoughts.
No, I just hope that Trump is more than he seems. I really, the prayers of the world, you could say, rest on Donald Trump right now with regard to the Levant and maybe even the region and maybe even the globe. And he has no clue of that. He has no clue of that. He's not smart enough, historically versed enough, capable enough, experienced enough. He doesn't know any of that. He operates in the moment. And that moment for him is colored majorly by his own perceptions at the moment. Golf is a perfect game for him.
It's, well, if it doesn't get us into war with Iran, then he always have the hot tomahawks to start a war with Russia. So it's
There's another story too. The tomahawks are really, I go back to 1984 when we first got Tomahawk. Yeah, it's an old missile, slow, a lot of upgrades and so forth. But the only version of Tomahawk that is really capable is the nuclear version.
Well, Colonel Wilkerson, thank you so much for your time and letting me pick your brain. So thanks again.
Surely. Good to see you again.